Core subject number 6, 3/4 guarantee. The disclaimer. This presentation is provided by the Labor Brain Inc. The presenter, Kaylin Fraser, is not a lawyer. This information is not legal services. Let's get to it. The gist. At the end of the contract period, H-2A employers must check to see if workers were paid for at least 3/4 of the hours listed in the contract. If not, they must pay them the hours needed to make up the difference. The details. I think that the 3/4 guarantee section of the H-2A rules is the most poorly explained, so therefore it's not surprising that it's also the area of H-2A that employers find most confusing. It's really the most basic of concepts, as stated in the gist. You have a contract with H-2A workers. That contract lists a certain number of hours per week with a start date and an end date. If at the end of the contract period you look back at your workers' hours and they were offered work for at least 3/4 of the time you promised in the contract, then you have met your obligation. However, if you had horrible weather conditions, or you overestimated the number of workers needed, or you are a farm service provider and your number of contracts with clients dropped unexpectedly, then there's a chance that you weren't able to offer all of your workers 3/4 of the promised contract hours. In that case, you have to pay for the gap. So if a contract was for 800 hours and the worker was only offered work for 550 hours, you would owe that person 50 hours times their hourly wage, or their regular rate if they were making piece rate, to bring them up to the 600-hour mark, which is 3/4 of 800. Now let's go over some specifics that come up with this concept. First, if a worker arrives after the start date of the contract, you determine their total contract hours starting with the day they arrived, not the start date of the contract. When you are determining the total hours in your contract, you take the weekly hours listed, multiply by the total weeks in the contract, and then add in any hours for partial weeks. Then you subtract any hours that fall on federal holidays or a worker's Sabbath, because those aren't considered work days. After you've determined the total hours promised by the contract, then you determine how many hours were offered to each individual worker. The reason you have to do this on an individual basis is because one worker may have been sick and not worked on a day when everyone else did. Or it's possible that one worker did not agree to work more than the contract hours listed for one day when others did. Every day of the contract, you are required to record the number of hours worked by the employee and the number of hours offered to the employee. Many times, those will be the same number, but they can be different. For example, let's say you list 50 hours in your contract, with 9 hours per day, Monday through Friday, and 5 hours on Saturday. If today is a Tuesday and it rains in the morning, so everyone only works 5 hours, then for today, everyone would have 5 hours offered and 5 hours worked. If one worker was sick all day, then that one worker would have 5 hours offered, but 0 hours worked. If tomorrow there were 11 hours of work available and everyone chose to work 11 hours, which is above the contractual 9 hours, then everyone would have 11 hours offered and 11 hours worked. However, if one worker were sick tomorrow and couldn't work, then he would only have 9 hours offered. Notice he doesn't have 11, even though that's what everyone else worked, because 9 is what is listed in the contract. And he would have 0 hours worked. In essence, you can recoup hours towards the 3/4 guarantee on non-contract days and above contract hours if employees choose to work those. But if a worker is unavailable or chooses not to, then you can only count the hours as listed in the contract and nothing more. For some employers, they find it too difficult to track these hours offered on an individual basis. In the case of a DOL investigation, those employers will only be able to claim the hours worked and paid for each worker. Most times that will be okay because the workers will have been paid more than 3/4 of the hours. But if you had a worker that was sick for weeks, you could end up being liable for hours for that employee if you couldn't prove that they had many hours offered but weren't able to work them because of sickness. Many employers think that the 3/4 guarantee requires them to pay for 3/4 of the hours each individual week of the contract. Or maybe they realize that it's actually for the entire contract, but they think it's a requirement to pay for 3/4 of the hours. But it's neither of those things. It's just a requirement to offer employment for 3/4 of the hours. Also, as discussed in other videos, You must pay the 3/4 guarantee to all workers, foreign and U.S. workers in corresponding employment, unless a worker abandons the job or is terminated for cause according to the H-2A standard. Common mistakes. The first, employers overhire. So make sure that you consider your 3/4 guarantee obligation when determining how many workers you need. You don't want to get into a situation where you've requested and then received so many H-2A workers that now you find it hard to get everybody the number of hours needed to meet the 3/4 guarantee, especially in a year where you might have less work because of weather or a loss of contracts with clients. Next, overestimating the end of the season. Employers, rightfully so, want to make sure that their workforce is here until the very end of the season, and sometimes it's hard to know exactly when that will be. But make sure that you consider again your 3/4 obligation when determining the end date of your contract. The 3/4 guarantee is determined by the end date of the contract, not when you send a worker home. Purposely lowballing hours. Your H-2A certification has to be an honest representation of the hours that you think that you will be working. Look back at your last 5 years to determine what's an average. How many hours are these workers usually working? Because if the Department of Labor does an investigation, that's what they're going to look at to see if the hours that you listed in your contract were honest. And I think there's, enough wiggle room that if it's within about 10 hours, you probably won't have a violation. They might just talk to you about trying to estimate it closer to the number of hours. But if your workers are regularly working 60 or 65 hours a week, yet you continue to put 40 hours a week on your contract so that your 3/4 guarantee isn't so high, the Department of Labor is onto that practice and they will assess a violation for that. Next, no hours offered record. So technically it is a requirement that you keep a record of these hours offered, but like I mentioned, many employers find it too burdensome. So it's your choice, depending on the liability. If you always are well above your 3/4 guarantee, then it's probably not something that you want to worry about. Next, incorrect hours offered records. If you've decided to keep the hours offered records, make sure that you're doing it correctly based on those examples that I gave. To-do list. First, considering your 3/4 guarantee, how many workers should you be requesting and what should the dates of your contract be? Number 2, make sure that the hours listed on your contract are based in reality. Number 3, decide whether or not you're going to keep hours offered records. Remember, it is a requirement, but I know many employers that just say to the Department of Labor, listen, I didn't keep these records. We're just going to call my hours worked records as my hours offered records. I'm not going to claim any more hours than what were actually worked. Number 4, if you're going to keep the hours offered records, do it correctly. Up next, video number 7, earnings records and pay statements.